Hello. We are back. Unfortunately, we had some sort of technical crash of some kind. We didn't lose our internet. OBS was fine, but YouTube
said it was fine, but it lied.
Yeah, YouTube said it was fine, and it crashed up. So we don't know how that happened. But we're back. What we'll do for those of you that are watching live is we will edit these two pieces together and re-upload it as a single video so that you have one concurrent thing, because I was in the middle of giving a great talk.
Yeah, I felt bad having to cut you off, but then I saw a bunch of posts for lag and you were in the middle of like a really heartfelt speech, which now you'll never be able to capture that again.
Well, yeah. Well, let's try. Okay.
All right.
So the question came down to what happens if the player characters come to Lucretia Matthias, they find out the truth of the falling fire and are like, we're going to expose your secrets to everybody. And Lucretia Matthias would respond in such a way, well, for many of the followers of the falling fire, it would make them believe more. Because Lucretia Matthias would say, yes, this world is coming to an end. Yes, this is a time of despair, but this is also a time of heroes seizing a glorious destiny. For so many folk who have no meaning or purpose in their lives, what greater purpose can you offer than by being part of something beautiful and amazing? This is a chance for you to be a hero, to make that noble sacrifice, to do that amazing thing, to change the world, to save this world. That appeal to that higher good, that desire in everyone that wants our lives to have meaning and purpose, that wants us to know how it's all going to end. That's what Lucretia Matthias appeals to. For many of the people that live in this world of Drakenheim, their world is falling apart. Their world is a world of famine, war, of chaos. Their world is a world where many parents have had to bury their children, where people have seen sickness and death ravage their lives. For many people, the idea of giving their life to be part of something greater is beautiful. It is a gesture of faith. It is a way that they can take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them. It is a thing that gives their lives meaning. And I think that for me, it is a bit of a culty sort of thing, right? It is this idea, it's this seductive idea of getting to be a hero, of being able to be something bigger than yourselves. But it's still appealing to those sorts of things that all people want. And for many of the common folk in this world, it's a very seductive argument. And despite the truth, they're like, yeah, this is beautiful. Lucretia Matthias talks about how this is the way that you can be the light, find the path through the long night, the endless shadow, the inner fire within you released, that will save the world. And for many people, that is a seductive thing. You and I might look at that and be like, that is crazy cult hogwash. But I guarantee you there are many people out there that is just the thing that they've been waiting to hear all their lives.
Yeah, and somehow I'm going to have to try to play Lucretia Matthias at my own table the way you do, and that's going to be tough. Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that. That was an amazing speech, and good job. And again, thank you everybody for bearing with us through odd technical difficulties. It says in the book, this is from Austin Gerald, it says in the book that the Academy takes in children, but it also says that older people can sometimes gain the ability to cast spells. So what would the Academy do if a grandmother or grandfather suddenly displays the abilities of a Mageborn? We kind of touched on this a little bit, but the rules for the way that magic is dictated in this world are not something that is like concrete. It's a loose law, and it's a loose guideline, and the academy brings in children. But if you're an adult and you develop magic powers,
you're
the academy,
a player character. Basically, the only time this ever happens is to player characters in the setting.
Yeah.
Like, the only people who find magical powers as a grandmother or as an adult or anything like that in this world would be a player character. That's the only time that would ever occur. And in those cases, the academy is going to invite that player character to join the academy, to be taught, to hone their magical abilities, but they can't force them because they're an adult.
Yeah. Rockwall Guy asks, I'm struggling in my campaign to get the players to meet all the factions early. How important is that? If they're focusing on one or two factions, should I railroad them a little harder with the random encounters, or let them meet them in their own time? I don't think you need to use the random encounters. I think that there are things that all the factions want done in the city of Drakkenheim. A group of adventurers who are doing well for one faction will gain the interest of the other factions naturally. Most of the factions do not want the other factions to succeed in their goals before they succeed in their own. So if the player characters do a couple missions for one of the factions, you can easily have the next time that they return to Emberwood Village, because they have to, one of the other faction lieutenants shows up and just says, hey, I've seen you've been doing some really good work around Drakenheim. We've got some jobs for you if you're interested. Right away, you get to introduce these other factions. You as the DM kind of get to dictate where and when they step in. And keep in mind that all the factions are interested in the party. When the campaign starts, all the factions are trying to gain a foothold in the city and struggling to do so. The player characters are the tipping point that tips the scales in a certain direction. And all of the faction lieutenants and leaders know that they have this potential and want to exploit it. So they'll come to the party.
And by getting the player characters to meet all the factions early, it can literally just be one encounter, one interaction, one role-playing moment in Emberwood Village. It doesn't have to, meeting the faction doesn't have to be, they did a mission for the faction and you dedicated a whole session to it. You can let it grow slowly. It just has to be, the players just have to know that all the factions exist and know who they go to if they want to talk to one of the faction members.
Troy asks, what are some ways as a DM you keep interest levels up for factions that the party doesn't gravitate towards immediately? I feel like I actually have a very similar answer, is you complicate things using that faction.
That faction has the solution to the problem. That faction can mediate a conflict. That faction is a neutral party or an unexpected interloper.
Yeah, I think that there's some really good plays where use one of the plot hooks presented in the book for a faction that the players aren't interested in and make it the best solution to a problem that the players are trying to solve.
I agree. Agreed. Nemo wants to know, where do the Queensmen take long rests if Buckle Down Row is in the haze? Astute observation. They don't. Nobody lives in Buckle Down Row. It's just a constant street party, right? You have to remember that Buckle Down Row is like a street of taverns. So just like, there's constant activity in after hours bars, nightclubs, and general areas, no one's actually living there. The people that go to Buckle Down Row come and go, and most of the gangs and the outlaw bands and everything like that, they probably have a hideout somewhere in the countryside or in an abandoned village that they come and go to, or they might even go back to Emberwood Village if they can. But they use Buckle Down Row as like their meeting place where they need to hide and lay low, rather than a place where they live.
Yeah, it's not really something described in the book, which is kind of interesting. But you can, in our starting episode, The Road to Drakkenheim, there is a group of bandits who sort of accost you on the road, and they are all living in a farmstead nearby. Keep in mind that the lands surrounding Drakenheim are no longer fertile soil. There are hundreds of abandoned farms. And those are great places for gangs to hang out, live, build little bases, and then travel in to the city to hang out in Buckle Down Row, deal with the Queen of Thieves, talk to the lieutenants, get their jobs, get their money, get their drink on, join in the fighting pits, and then return back home to their whatever farmstead they're living in. So if your players want to go hunting gangs in farmsteads, I guess that's a possibility. But to me, that's not as interesting as going to Buckle Down Row and dealing with the Queen of Thieves.
Hunter Fenrir wants to know, the Queen of Thieves' misdirection ability, when she uses this, does she take the damage from the attack, or is the damage negated? The wording suggests it's negated, but I wanted to make sure it's the damage is negated. Yeah, it's negated.
Yeah. Kroby1. Yeah. How would you recommend modifying or running in a session one of the faction leaders if they are fighting with the party against monsters or a rival faction? I worry that an NPC ally with legendary actions, resistances, might upstage the party in combat. If a faction leader joins the party and is fighting with them, remove their legendary actions and remove their legendary resistance.
But give them to the party if they're an ally. You could actually have the faction leader give them like a pep talk and they give their legendary resistances to the party members. That can be like anyone in the party can use one of the three uses, and like anyone in the party can use you could actually give this thing where like every party member gets one action surge that they can take in the combat as long as the faction leader is there. I do want to state, the only times in your campaign where it is appropriate for the faction leaders to be in battle alongside the player characters are if it's involving Castle Draken or the Cathedral. Or
the Battle of Templegate. No, not even then.
No, even then, you want to have Theodore Marshall doing something else. You know what I mean? Like, Templegate is another one. The other one would be the invasion of a faction stronghold. The faction leader should not be joining the player characters in combat for anything less than those things. That's the stakes that's required for that to happen. But then, they don't have legendary actions. They don't have legendary resistances. And I mean, there's a couple of faction leaders where maybe you simplify their spell casting. Like, one of the things that we did with both Eldritch Runeweaver and Lucretia Matthias is they kind of do this thing where they buff the party up with magic and then don't go into combat themselves, right? Like, I did this thing where Eldritch Runeweaver would say, what spell do you want me to cast on you guys? So I'm going to cast Fly on you all, or I'm going to cast Haste on someone, or a big buff spell. And Lucretia Matthias can be used in the same way, and then they don't actually have to go into combat directly.
Yeah, some things to keep in mind. Lucretia Matthias is a 90-year-old woman, and she won't dive into combat. Sorry, apparently I need to drink a water. 1 second. So Lucretia Matthias, 90-year-old woman, won't go running into combat. The Amethyst Academy are not combat mages. They are academic type. They will help the party, but they won't dive into combat. The Queen of Thieves, if you're siding with her, she likes to save her own butt more than anything else. She has her swarms of minions. She might give you a group of gang members to go along with you, but she herself likes to control things from her secret layers. So really, the only two factions that are probably joining you in battle are the Hooded Lanterns or the Silver Order. And if you are siding with those two factions, that's when you implement these rules. But also, these characters might have other things that they need to do. In the Battle of Templegate, in the show, we rode in with Theodore Marshall, but Theodore Marshall had to go command his troops while we did the covert operations to get the gate open. So by coming up with a way to separate, the party is the covert ops, and the faction leader has to attend to the whole faction.
Yeah.
In the rare cases that they do join, really we saw that in the battle in Slaughterstone Square, and we saw that in the castle.
Yeah.
And in those two instances, there were a lot of other things going on.
Yeah. This is from chat. Brandon Schillen wants to know, could Caspia be used as a 6th faction? If so, how could that be implemented in a fun way like in the original game? So, Caspia is not... one of the things to bear in mind is that Caspia and Illyria are nations, not factions. So you have to zoom in a little bit more, because the Silver Order is a faction from Illyria. The people of Westamar talk about them as the Illyrians and the Caspians, but Pluto Jackson represents House Jackson. Jupiter Jones represents House Jones and the interests of those noble houses, because they have different goals. So Caspia as a whole, if you want to introduce it as factions, there's 6 great houses in Caspia. Joplin, Jones, Jagger, John, Joyce, Jones, Jackson. I might have said one twice. And so you can build those ones out as you see fit and what their interests are. In our campaign, Caspia didn't become a full-on faction because I used one Caspian noble house for a rival adventurer and the other was a player character. And so I think that if you want to add Caspia as a faction, that's the inroad there. If you don't have any player characters that are connected to Caspia, I think Caspia demands a connection from a player character in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And something else that we're probably going to talk about in a future book is the idea of creating noble houses as additional factions. But these factions only come into play if they are linked to a player character. And it needs to be important. And also keep in mind that, like, really when we got Caspian troops, Caspia was never actually represented as a fully fleshed faction in our campaign. Caspia was, we had NPCs show up. We had Pluto's dad show up, and he said, we have soldiers on the way. Those soldiers kind of just melded in to we have aligned with the Hooded Lanterns and the Amethyst Academy. Here's who we're aligned with. We added in some knights to the already existing factions, and they helped us out. And really, it was mostly a game of NPCs from Caspia that helped us out.
And this is the key thing. If you want to create your own faction for Drakenheim, the faction has to have 2 key things that it has an opinion on. The faction has to have an opinion on who should rule Drakenheim and what should be done about the delirium. And so the Caspians kind of don't care about either of those things. They care about who rules, but they don't have a huge opinion about delirium. And so that can be an interesting inroad. The other thing, and then you want to think about how the opinion of whatever faction, because people have asked, the common ones that we get asked about is, could you add a nature faction, like a druid faction, and could you add a Caspian faction or another noble house faction? The answer is yes, you could. If I was gonna add factions, I would probably do, like, those would be the 2 that I would add, and I would make it 7 factions instead of 5.
Mm-hmm.
Don't add a 6th faction, go to 7, so you got an odd number.
Yeah,
right?
It helps you avoid the like equal split.
Yeah,
you want it to be an odd number because you want some wild cards, you want some villains, you want some heroes.
And for the Caspians, I think that their answer to those questions are, we want the question of what do the Caspians want to do with delirium is a tough one, because I feel like they need to have an opinion about it. At the same time, the Caspians kind of want to get an inroad so that they don't rule Drakkenheim, but whoever is ruling Drakenheim is a Caspian puppet.
Also, keep in mind that every Caspian house wants to win the King's Moot.
Yeah.
And be the king of Caspia. And having foreign relations with Westamar is a very powerful position to put you in place to become king of Caspia. So a house arriving in Westamar to try to deal politically with who's going to rule is kind of them trying to cement their own rule in their kingdom.
And then I think that if you wanted to do the nature faction, I think that their ultimate goal is they want Drakenheim returned to nature and they want to destroy the delirium. Or they think that delirium might represent a new evolution. That could be
you could go either way.
Weird angle with it.
But then you are kind of stepping on the toes of either the Falling Fire or the Silver Order.
Yeah, and that's why if you go with the nature faction, they need to be associated with the old gods in some way so that there's actually a religious, and then you end up with like weird religious like conflicts there as well, right? But you gotta, and again, ultimately with any faction, you want there to be trade-offs, right? And then you can just follow the template, give them strike teams, give them schemes, give them personality traits, and that's how you can homebrew your own faction for Drakenheim, or change one of the factions. You can follow the template that we created in the book to make your own faction, and you can follow that template for creating factions for your own homebrew settings too.
In the chat, Bruno asked this question several times, and I'm actually going to modify it because I think that we've answered this question a lot. Which NPCs do you like the most? But I'm gonna change up that question a bit, Bruno, and I hope you don't mind. Monty, not from the live show, other than the faction leaders, which new NPC that we put into the book did you think was the coolest?
I like Yogan Ghostweaver. I like the Druid of Morrigan.
Cool.
I loved when we got the art for that character. Really like just this weird old druid. I really like Elven Druid. Really like him. Yeah.
Yeah. In the book, for me, I loved the addition of the two new Malfeasant wizards that are in the book, the Pale Man and Ryan Greymere. I think they show two very different sides of a coin. Mm-hmm. And I think they're very interesting. And they actually added a really unique element to what it means to be a Malfeasant wizard in Drakenheim.
I also really like the dwarves, the Ironhelm dwarves.
The Ironhelm dwarves was fun.
They're really great. We created a lot of cool side members of the Queen of Thieves' various outlaw bands that I really like them as well. I think that those would be, because everyone knows that we love the Rat Prince and the Queen of Thieves and Blackjack Bell, right? Those are like, that's the truth of the question. And there's been other Q&As where we've done this one where we're not to diminish that question, but like, I love role-playing Blackjack Mal. I love role-playing the Rat Prince, and I love role-playing the Queen of Thieves. But I love all of my twisted children.
I don't get to roleplay them, so my favorites are a little bit different. I'm going to throw a shout-out to Jupiter Jones. The unsung hero.
I love Jupiter Jones. Oh, man. Yeah.
The unsung hero. I hated him when we first met him. And Monty, in great storytelling fashion, pulled a Game of Thrones on me, in the sense that when I say that, I mean, in Game of Thrones, there were characters that in season 1, I was like, I hate this character. And then towards the middle of the show, I'm like, do I love this character? And I feel like that was Jupiter Jones' journey for me, as I started off being like, I think we should kill this guy, which was a really dark thing when you think about it. But I was like, this guy's a nuisance. He's in our way. Let's just get rid of him. And then about halfway through the show, I was like, we can't live without Jupiter Jones. I love this guy. And that was a really cool, I think he had one of the coolest character arcs for an NPC in the whole show.
Lag1acris asks, didn't the Illyrians already break the Edicts of Lumen by having the Divine Matriarch as their ruler? So you could argue that, but the Divine Matriarch is the de facto authority in Illyria, but is not technically the monarch. And that's how they get around it, right? And also the Edicts of Lumen don't say that divine spellcasters can't have noble titles. Typically, the Edicts of Lumen were written under the assumption that any cleric or paladin would willingly swear an oath or take a vow where they would give up their noble titles. So again, the Edicts of Lumen are not a perfect document. They're flawed, they have mistakes, they have omissions, and everybody's trying to get around them. Yes, that's actually, that you're asking that question is like, yes, you get it. Like, that's... Yeah.
I do want to mention that the Edicts of Lumen were written by the Illyrian society, basically by the religion. And yes, if you're reading between the lines of the Edicts of Lumen and you're saying, wait a second, this document kind of shoves Mageborn down and lifts religious folk up. Yep.
Yeah, and you're like, wow, there's a lot of problems with the Edicts of Lumen. Yes, there are. But again, it comes back to that whole thing. Yes, there are a lot of problems with the Constitution of the United States of America. Good luck changing it. That's the allegory there, right? Like, the Constitution of the United States of America is a good document. I'm not an American. I'm a Canadian. Our Charter of Rights and Freedoms and our documents are also flawed. There's a lot of problems. When humans write a document that makes a bunch of laws, there's going to be problems. And that's kind of the thing that we're wrestling with, right? And so if you have these questions about like, why doesn't it talk about that? Well, that's because it is like, maybe, yes, there are a few things that I didn't think of, but yeah, it's the problem. Like, the Edicts of Lumen exist to create conflicts. They exist to create problems so that players can find interesting ways to solve them and overcome those obstacles.
Any roleplay tips for the Dragons of Drakenheim? That's an interesting question. Monty, any I guess you've never really had to roleplay them. Okay, actually, here's a question. I'm going to ask a question based on that question. Are the Dragons of Drakkenheim, Minazorond and Argonath, are they sentient speaking dragons or monstrous bitey scary dragons?
They are sentient speaking dragons, but they're also kind of transcendent in their way. Like, the way that I think of these metallic dragons is they are almost like a force of nature, right? Like, you know how like Captain Planet doesn't really have a personality? Like, Captain Planet is just like generic hero, right? Like, he's by your powers combined, here I am, right? And that's what like Argonath and Minazorond are kind of that. Like, these dragons are dragons that bound themselves to the city of Drakkenheim through their actions, and in many ways you can think of them almost as protector spirits. So yes, they're intelligent, right? But they're protector creatures. Think of the dragon at the end of Shang-Chi.
Right.
Like, obviously that was an intelligent creature, but it is a creature now that has a purpose, to be a protector. That is their purpose, right? So they're not automatons. They're not mindless, but they have given themselves to this purpose.
I got an answer for this one that, Cameron, you're probably not going to love my answer. What's the in-game reason for why rope trick doesn't work?
First works, of all, you just can't use it to escape the haze.
Yeah, so rope trick works fine, but you can't take a long rest inside of your rope trick. Why? What's the in-game reason? Well, first of all, the out-of-game reason is that we want the problem of the haze to be a situation that the players need to solve through the campaign. It's part of the story of the campaign. So what's my in-game reason? The haze is a magical mist that has done things like transform solid objects into flesh and glass. It changes people into monsters. It messes with magic in weird ways. If you try to teleport into or out of Drakkenheim, you might just explode or turn into a pile of goo. So the answer, unfortunately, is a simple delirium screws with magic. And when you cast Rope Trip, you go in there and you're like, why is it full of haze in here? Because delirium sucks.
Yeah, and it's a level 2 spell that isn't strong enough to overcome the energies of the haze, right? You might think of it in the same way that like the domain of dread of Curse of Strahd, like Ravenloft, magic is kind of corrupted at its very core just by being cast in Ravenloft. Spells in Drakenheim are the same, right? It messes with magic.
Somebody brought up that did we not do that in episode 12 of our campaign? Yeah, and then after that, we kind of decided that breaks what we wanted Drakenheim to be about.
Yeah, the original, you got to remember that like the original campaign is basically us playtesting Drakenheim, right? Like we kind of found a bunch of the issues, like Rope Trick, and we're like, oh, this kind of breaks contamination. Let's fix that.
Yeah, you'll have to, like, you kind of have to treat our live stream, at least season 1. Season 1 is separate from what you'll find in the book.
It's a prototype. It's an evolving world. Yeah.
You'll see halfway through season 2, we start using the contamination mechanics, maybe a little earlier than halfway. But it took partway through season 2 before you actually see the contamination mechanics show up in our games because we were still creating them. So the book is kind of the new version. It's us fixing all of the things that we needed to think about from playing in our own world.
Yeah.
It's 8:17. This was, we've already gone over a little bit. Do you want to take a couple more questions from chat?
Yeah, I think we could grab a few questions there. Scrolling back up from the previous chat that we kind of lost, and just see if we got any questions there. Do you have any that we've pulled in from chat yet?
I feel like I answered a few of the ones. It's also tough because this is a new chat, right?
Yeah. Super Milkbox wanted to know, this was a great question. Would you describe Drakenheim as a low magic or a high magic setting? In each case, how often should players find magical items and gear? Drakenheim is a high magic place in a low magic setting. That's what it is, right? Like the protagonists of a Drakenheim campaign are the ones that interact with the magical world, right? They're the ones that experience magical things. Those are the ones that experience magic items. But this is a situation where the experience of the player characters is unique because they're the heroes of the story, right? They're the protagonists. So they experience more magic than the average person. Drakenheim is not a world of adventurers necessarily. They're very rare, right? So it is a low magic setting, but it's a world where powerful magic exists and has had a profound impact on the world. My rule of thumb, the player characters should find at least one magic item of each rarity over the course of the entire campaign, maybe an extra uncommon or rare item. That's the rule of thumb that we've gone with for a very long time. I usually have my characters find a very rare magic item around level 11. They can have an uncommon or a rare item or two before then, and I keep the legendary items for later, unless the legendary items are like a sentient magic item or like a plot item.
I see a couple cool questions. Nathan asks, earlier you mentioned how 3 players can domino into a death spiral, but also you say that a group of 3 is the best situationally for roleplay. Which is fundamentally better, 4 or 3? My answer for this is if you are playing at home, and you are a newer DM with a newer group of players, 4 players is your better option. Not everybody feels like getting in depth with role playing, and it's a little easier to manage a 4-person party in terms of if you accidentally kill one of them and one of them goes down in combat, it can be better managed. A group of 3 players, we prefer for streaming because it gives each player more time in the spotlight to roleplay. When we're streaming, we dial our roleplay up to 11. We are basically in character from the moment the cameras turn on to when they go off, which is not something you usually get at a home game. For those purposes, we love 3 players for getting the roleplay juices going. But I think at your home games, 4 is the magic number.
Yeah. The also I'll say is like, notice how a lot of stories have 3 main characters, right? Like Han, Luke, and Leia, Hermione, Ron, and Harry, right? What's another one that
Lord of the Rings splits into a bunch of 3-person parties.
Yes.
You have Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas. You have Sam, Frodo, and Gollum. I feel like there's more in there.
Pippin, Merry, and Treebeard.
There's a 3-person party,
right?
With Harry Potter, with Star Trek, the original. That's one of my favorite examples because they are cliche. So in their definitions of Kirk, Spock, and Bones,
it's the magic of the rule of 3. Right? Like that's the big thing. Like the rule of 3 kind of makes this thing work. And that's why it works in a stream game in particular. But I agree with Kelly, for your home games, 4 is good. And the book is balanced around a party of 4 in mind. But bear in mind that the way we wrote Drakkenheim is it is not perfectly balanced. It is intentionally imbalanced. And some situations deliberately stack the situation against the player characters.
We might be able to take, I think this might be the last question we're taking tonight. But I do like this one. Was wondering if the idea of making the game into a hex crawl crossed your mind, and if so, did it factor in at all? I will say that originally, when Monty and I were first writing the book, we created Drakenheim as a hex grid map, and we were trying to make one adventure site per hex grid. What ended up happening is we started overcomplicating our own work, and it started getting too cumbersome to fit into the book. And we were like, something's not working. And I remember, Monty, it was one day when you came up with the hex map and showed it to me, you and I were both like, this solves all of our problems. Suddenly we were a few months into writing it and we were millions more problems. And then you were like, wait, new idea. We get rid of the hex map, and suddenly that solved all of our problems.
Yeah. So, I mean, you could. I just think that ultimately, like, we didn't play it that way, so I don't know how it would play. It could work, but we didn't play it that way, right?
Yeah.
I think maybe the city's too small. I think a hex crawl might need to be over a large geographic region to work.
Maybe.
Yeah.
We tried it.
Yeah.
And we weren't loving the results. It got clunky, and we were trying to cram too many things into the city.
Yeah. Yep. Well, with that, thank you all so much for your amazing questions. We're gonna patch the stream back together and re-upload this for those of you that watched live, and we will stay tuned for the other video guide series. We'll have that all together in a playlist, and hopefully this has answered more of your questions. We're going to continue to look for questions. We're probably going to release an errata of some kind as well. We got a couple of mechanical questions, so we'll probably have like an errata to the book of some kind, but that will probably come down a little while. So if there's any other questions, don't hesitate to hit us up. Of course, we're always on our Discord as well. If you want to become a patron of our show, chat with us through that. We respond to comments on all the YouTube videos very regularly as well too. So there's lots of ways to get in touch with us if you got more questions.
So, as always, thank you guys so much. It's been a treat. So many good questions, and the ones that we didn't get to, apologies. We tried to cover as many similar topics in one question as possible, and also with Monty saying we will probably work out an errata at some point. We tried to, with the time limit, we couldn't answer all the questions about rules stipulations within the book, because there are a few things that we need to kind of correct. No matter how much editing you go through, there's always a couple things that slip through.
Yep.
We've noticed them now. we're gonna try to get on top of that, and we might even get an FAQ going at some point to help answer some of these more well-known questions. The great thing about the world of Drakenheim is that we are available on social media, and we are most available in our patron Discord, and you can hit us up anytime there. And as Monty said, like we're always available, but that's a great way. We've had people in our patron Discord echo the idea that it is just wonderful to be able to not only run the campaign, but then check in with Monty and I about questions on how they're running it, or just giving ideas or feedback or bouncing ideas. Even if we're not around, the community in there is great for bouncing ideas off of. So check us out on Patreon, check us out on Discord if you join our Patreon. And yeah, that's a really great way to kind of keep the flow of chat going with us.
Thank you all so much for watching, and we will see you soon in the dungeons of Drakkenheim.
Bye.